like to invite Professor Peter Singer, please, to pose the affirmative case.
Thank you very much, and let me say I welcome the opportunity to debate this important public issue with Archbishop Anthony Fisher, and I thank him for accepting the invitation. I thank the University of Sydney and the Sydney University Catholic Society and all of those involved in it for having set up this opportunity. We are debating whether voluntary euthanasia should be legalised. So we have to ask, what do we mean by voluntary euthanasia? Anthony Fisher debated with Philip Nitschke a few years ago, and in the course of that debate he defined euthanasia as an act or calculated course of omission intended to shorten life with a supposedly merciful motivation. I'll accept that definition, so we don't have to argue about definitions. And of course, we have the term voluntary in there, so that means that the act or calculated course of omission must be performed at the request of the patient. I'd add, at the informed and considered request of the patient. It's important to note that this definition includes what is sometimes known, particularly in the United States, as physician-assisted dying, but I don't want to be accused of sheltering behind euphemisms, so let's just call it physician-assisted suicide. It includes a situation in which a patient, perhaps a terminally ill patient, depending on how the legislation is framed, patients they may ask their doctors for prescriptions for drugs that, when the prescription is filled and when the patient takes the drug, will cause them to die quickly and without distress. The legalisation of physician-assisted suicide would permit doctors to write such prescriptions on the request of their patient and after complying with whatever conditions the legislation lays down. This practice is legal in the United States, in the states of Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Vermont. It's also legal in Switzerland. And it will also, I expect, within the next 6 months, become legal across all of Canada, following a recent unanimous decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that struck down as unconstitutional laws that prohibited competent adults who were terminally ill or suffering from grievous and irremediable medical conditions from having such assistance from a physician who was willing to provide it. Now, I acknowledge that personally I don't see a great deal of ethical significance in the distinction between what I've just described and called physician-assisted suicide and the form of voluntary euthanasia that is legal now in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, and in Colombia, where terminally or incurably ill patients can request a lethal injection from their doctors, and the doctors can, if it is in accordance with their own conscience, give that injection. And I'd be very surprised if Anthony Fisher disagrees with me in saying that these two are morally equivalent or very close at least. But we might believe that legalising physician-assisted suicide, while not permitting a doctor to give a lethal injection, makes it more difficult for the practice to be abused by extending it to patients without their consent. And if we believe that, not saying whether we should, but it's possible, then we might think it more prudent to legalise only physician-assisted suicide. In any case, here's the key takeaway from what I'm doing with this discussion of the ways in which a doctor can intentionally perform at the patient's request a life-shortening act. If you agree that we should have laws similar to those that exist now in Oregon, Washington, etc., then you are agreeing with me that voluntary euthanasia should be legalised. You don't have to also go the step of saying we should have a law that allows doctors to give lethal injections. You may or may not think of that. Both are as I've defined the term using Anthony Fisher's definition. Both are forms of euthanasia. I should also say under what circumstances I believe voluntary euthanasia should be legal. I'm not an absolutist about autonomy. I do not want to make it easy for people to end their lives because of a condition that may be treatable or from which they have a reasonable prospect of recovery. In Oregon, Washington and Vermont, a patient must be terminally ill. That is, according to legislation, 2 doctors must certify that the patient cannot reasonably be expected to live for another 6 months. That's one possible standard under which we could legalise voluntary euthanasia. My preference is the standard used by the Supreme Court of Canada in its constitutional decision, which says it should be permissible for competent adults who request it and who have a grievous and irremediable medical condition that causes enduring suffering. But again, as I say, under the terms of our debate, we don't need to go that further step with the incurable condition. If I can only convince you that patients who are terminally ill and where 2 doctors say they are not likely to live for 6 months, that's the only conditions under which it can be legalised, well, it's still the case that you're agreeing with me that voluntary euthanasia should be legalised. Now that we know what we're debating, why should voluntary euthanasia be legalised? To answer that question, I think we should ask another one. Why do we normally consider killing an innocent person to be wrong? Not only wrong, but also properly a crime. That's a very basic question, clearly. We don't often ask ourselves, we take it for granted. But if we do, I think there's 2 important reasons why we should think that to be both wrong and a crime. Firstly, it's a violation of the autonomy of the person killed. In fact, it's the most, typically anyway, it's the most serious possible violation of that person's autonomy. It denies that person everything that they wanted to do for the rest of their life. Now you've killed them, they can't do it. So whatever their hopes and wishes and plans were, whatever it was they wanted to achieve, you've prevented them doing that, typically against their will, because they wanted to go on living, they wanted to do those things. So that's one important reason why we rightly make killing a serious crime. But clearly, in the case of voluntary euthanasia, the value that we properly place on autonomy does not count against assisting the patient to die, against physician-assisted suicide. It counts in favour of it, because that is the autonomous wish of the patient that you are fulfilling. Now, I think autonomy, as I say, is rightly a value, but I don't think it overrides all other values. For example, I don't think that a lovesick young adult who's in despair because the one he loves has rejected him or her, and therefore wants to die, I don't think you should regard that as a wish that you ought to fulfill or to assist. Even if you think it is, at this moment, this person's autonomous wish, you can safely predict that that mood will pass, that the young person will, in future, come to think of his or her life as well worth living, and you could then reasonably conclude that the value of that life and everything the person will obtain and be able to do through that life overrides the temporary violation of autonomy or liberty in that case. And that brings me to the second reason why we normally consider killing both morally wrong and a serious crime. Killing deprives the person of whatever good things that person would have experienced for the rest of their life. And I think we can be sufficiently optimistic to say that for most people, the rest of their life will typically bring a positive balance, more good things than bad things. So that too is a good reason why killing should be regarded as something that's wrong. But again, in the case of voluntary euthanasia, that reason no longer counts against killing, it actually counts in favour of killing. Because there the person has judged that the rest of their life cannot have a positive balance. They don't want it. They're the best judge, surely, assuming we're talking about a competent, well-informed adult and so on. They're the best judge of whether the quality of their life is still acceptable. And with the informed views of doctors about whether it can be expected to get better or not, they are in the best position to say, no, the rest of my life request, because it will save the person from bad experience. So I think we can conclude that the law against killing should not be absolute. It gives us no grounds for making it a crime when a competent person requests assistance with ending his or her life and has good reasons based on a terminal or an irremediable illness that has eliminated the patient's prospects of having an acceptable quality of life to make that request. In those circumstances, to assist that person in ending his or her life is not morally wrong and in a free society should not be a crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer. Archbishop Anthony Fisher to present the case for the negative.
Thank you, Scott, Mr. Chairman, and my alma mater, Sydney University and its Catholic Society, and Peter Singer. The recent film, The Water Diviner, was inspired by a true story of an Australian farmer who travelled to Turkey after World War I to discover the fate of his 3 sons who'd been reported missing in action at Gallipoli. A spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the film, and cover your ears. Towards the end of the film, Joshua Connor, played by Russell Crowe, finds his eldest son, Arthur, still alive. Art tells his father how his youngest brother, Henry, died. He died after being shot by the Turks. He bled out painfully for hours and finally begged his brother Art to shoot him, and Art did so. Art's anguish since killing his brother is evident in the film, but the film portrays his act sympathetically. A parallel story from the next World War is that of the brothers Stan and Butch Bissett. They grew up playing football together, enlisted together, fought side by side on the Kokoda track, until in 1942, Butch was severely wounded by Japanese machine gun fire. The platoon doctor could do nothing more for him than give him morphine. And so Stan held his brother Butch in his arms for 6 hours until he died. They sat laughing, crying, remembering the good times of their childhood, the trouble they got up to as kids, the times they played rugby together. Butch faded in and out of consciousness, and Stan shared one last song with his brother Butch as he breathed his last. These are examples of 2 different responses to human suffering and dying. Both are motivated by mercy. Both win our sympathy. The first says it's better to kill someone than let them suffer. Better to fulfill someone's request to be killed than to resist it. It's premised on the view that some lives are so wretched or personal autonomy so important that justifies killing. The second story accepts the reality of physical and psychological and spiritual pain, but deals with suffering not by killing the suffering person, but by giving them every reasonable assistance and accompanying them in love and care. Arguably, that second approach puts a higher value on human life and relationships, but also is more demanding. It asks more of people. Professor Singer's view of life is that its point is fulfilling preferences. Whereas on my view, human life has an intrinsic meaning. It's intrinsically valuable. However reduced our condition, we have a radical dignity from our first breath to our last. And that's the basis of our equality and our human rights. It's the reason we protect even the hopeless. So that while every moral means should be used to relieve suffering, doctors must never kill their patients. In humility, they recognise that sometimes there's nothing more ethically and practically to be done than standing by and investing ourselves in someone's care. Now, many people think that pain and suffering should, where reasonable, be minimised. I agree, as long as we hold on to the where reasonable bit. Where people might differ is that I think the suffering person, killing the suffering person, is never the reasonable way to deal with their suffering. But even if you're agnostic on that question of whether killing is ever permitted, you'd surely agree that if mercy drives us in this area, we'd first be ensuring that everything possible was done to relieve people's pain and suffering. We'd ensure that every person who could benefit had access to appropriate pain management and pastoral care. Yet we know that millions of people in our world and thousands of people in Australia die every year without access to palliative care. Furthermore, if relieving suffering is what the euthanasia debate is all about, then we have to be honest with ourselves about where that leads. Because euthanasia can relieve suffering not just of dying people, but of the seriously sick, the mentally ill, those tired of life, not just competent adults, but babies, children, the unconscious, the disabled, as Professor Singer has argued elsewhere. In this, he's just being consistent. If it's about relieving suffering, there are a lot more people who are suffering than those who are terminally ill or have some very, very serious medical problem. Of course, relief of suffering isn't the only reason that he or others argue for euthanasia's being legalised. They also argue on the basis of autonomy, that it's what people want, but sometimes they judge that their quality of life is so low they don't want to continue. If it's out of that kind of respect for autonomy that some euthanasia enthusiasts want the euthanasia pill available much more broadly, even to healthy people, even to teenagers. The freedom to die when and how I want can't reasonably be restricted just to the hard cases. No wonder then that wherever euthanasia has been legalised, it's gradually extended to more and more people. It's not that euthanasia cultures are uniquely made up of moral monsters. It's that that is where the logic of autonomy-based euthanasia or relief of suffering-based euthanasia will lead you. Euthanasia regimes, in my view, actually reduce people's autonomy because they embed the social expectation that certain people will elect death. People whose autonomy is already reduced by pain, fear, depression. Yet the message that they are no longer protected by homicide laws and might be better off dead. Having classed the frail, elderly, disabled and others as expendable, the community is likely to do less for them and leave them feeling worthless. So ironically, in the name of autonomy, people's freedom is narrowed and their very lives, the premise of their freedom, put at risk. Till now it's been a defining aspect of our health professions that they never kill or harm their patients. International and national codes of medical and nursing ethics all forbid euthanasia. Do we want our health professionals assessing which patients should live and which should die? Do we want them gradually desensitised to harming and killing? Do we want medical students trained in giving lethal doses? Legalising euthanasia would be a revolution in medical practice and nursing practice. It would undermine the save, heal, care ethic and our trust in health professionals and place a terrible burden on those professionals. Till now, it's been a defining aspect of our law that human life is protected, that human rights are universal, that there are no exceptions to our homicide laws. But legal euthanasia would create two classes of citizens. Those whose lives are inviolable, most of us, and those whose lives can be taken, the terminally ill, disabled, and some others. I think the first purpose of law is to protect the innocent and vulnerable. And I think it's that belief that is the basis of most Australians' opposition to state-sanctioned killing, even of criminals. It's that the prohibition on killing is a cornerstone of our law and social relationships and protects each of us impartially and equally. Finally, who dies in a euthanasia culture? The weak, the frail, elderly, the sick, the handicapped, the depressed, babies. No wonder that advocates for the elderly and for those with disabilities oppose euthanasia much of the time. As one put it, we're scared enough already. We'll be terrified if euthanasia becomes state-sanctioned. Euthanasia is sold to the community as being for the extreme cases of unrelievable pain, especially for the terminally ill. But then it's extended to those who are chronically sick, those with mental illnesses, those with existential despair. There is bracket creep in euthanasia. It evolves. First, we're told it's for competent, informed, consenting adults only. And then it's extended to the incompetent, the unconscious, babies. First, it's for those who judge their own lives to be too burdensome for them. But how quickly societies that go down that path start making the judgment that those lives are too burdensome for others. Putting Granny out of her misery so easily becomes putting Granny out of our misery. The bracket creep is built into the very logic of euthanasia. Once we start deciding that death is in the best interests of some people, then of course there will be others in the queue. That's exactly what's happened in Holland and in Belgium that have been offered to us as examples of voluntary euthanasia working well tonight. In Holland, it was supposed to be for people in extreme suffering, consenting adults. But after 10 or so years of that experience, it became legal to do it for babies. Now, it's the ordinary way of dying for about 5,000 people in the Netherlands every year, not just extreme, unrelievable suffering. We all want to relieve suffering. We all want to respect autonomy. Surely we can find respectful, life-affirming ways of doing that don't involve killing each other, and in the process, putting the most vulnerable in our community at risk.
I'll invite Professor Singer. You have 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you. I have to say, I'm disappointed by what I can only regard as Anthony Fisher's willful refusal to look at the evidence about the countries that he has described. For example, he talked about the rapid creep of the euthanasia culture in every place where it has been legalized. Do you know how many people used the legislation in Oregon in 2014, after it has been in place for 14 years? 105. This is in a state with a population of around 4 million. It's 1 death in 3,000 that uses this legislation. I can't see any rapid creep here, and I know of no cases where it is even alleged that it has been extended beyond the requirements of the legislation. And the situation is similar in Washington. In Vermont, the legislation is relatively recent. So I just don't think that this is true. I also reject the account of the situation in the Netherlands. It's significant that the voluntary euthanasia was fully legalised in the Netherlands in 2002. Since then, there have been a succession of different governments, including a long period of governments where the leading party in power was the Christian Democrats, and there has been 0 attempts to rescind or repeal that legislation. That's because the population of the Netherlands is convinced that it works well, and that's why the neighbouring countries of Belgium and Luxembourg, which are in a much better position than any other nations to observe what is going on, then adopted similar legislation for themselves. The same is true, of course, with Washington, which is a neighbouring state of Oregon. But you don't have to believe me. I suggest you look at what was said in the Canadian case, which led to that constitutional decision I mentioned in my remarks. It was started off in the Supreme Court of British Columbia with 3 plaintiffs who were terminally ill asking for a constitutional right to have assistance in dying. And in the hearing, Justice Lynn Smith of the Supreme Court of British Columbia took evidence from 57 witnesses called both by the plaintiffs, by the Attorney General of Canada, who was opposing the application, and by the Attorney General of British Columbia, who was also opposing the application. She wrote a judgment of more than 300 pages, weighing, a substantial part of which weighs the evidence she heard, and she concludes, an absolute prohibition might be called for if the evidence from permissive jurisdictions showed abuse of patience, or carelessness, or callousness on the part of physicians, or evidence of the reality of a practical slippery slope. However, that is not what the evidence shows. I found that the evidence supports the conclusion that a system with properly designed and administered safeguards could, with a very high degree of certainty, prevent vulnerable persons from being induced to commit suicide, while permitting exceptions for competent, fully informed persons acting voluntarily to receive physician-assisted death. On appeal, the case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, which, as I've said, unanimously upheld Justice Smith's ruling, and on the particular point of the slippery slope, commented as follows. The trial judge made no palpable and overriding error in concluding, on the basis of evidence from scientists, medical practitioners, and others who are familiar with end-of-life decision-making in Canada and abroad, that a permissive regime with properly designed and administered safeguards was capable of protecting vulnerable people from abuse and error. So the Supreme Court found no palpable mistake in the judges weighing up that very careful review of the evidence. And again, there simply is no evidence that the frail and elderly and vulnerable are more using this than other people. In fact, a study of the situation in Oregon found that in proportion to the number of deaths in the population, which of course does involve more elderly, in proportion to that, those using the legislation were overwhelmingly white, 95% white, significantly more than the population of Oregon, more highly educated, 47% of them had a bachelor's degree, again higher than the average in the population, and not particularly elderly, in fact disproportionately in the under 65 age bracket. So you really need to look at the evidence, I believe, before making these claims about what is supposedly the logic of euthanasia, which I don't believe it is. In fact, the evidence shows that euthanasia can be and has been safely practiced without any kind of creep beyond what the legislation specifies. Thank you.
Archbishop Anthony Fisher, you have 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very encouraged that Professor Singer wants such a conservative regime of euthanasia. I think in many of his writings he argues, in fact, for a much larger group of people to fall under the ambit of those who might be killed, either choosing it or others choosing for them. But at least for now he wants to keep it very restricted. A permissive regime with many watertight safeguards. And he points us to the places who've achieved that. Well, let's look at those quickly. In Holland, Professor Theo Boer of Groningen, a long-time euthanasia advocate on the euthanasia, several of the euthanasia review boards, recently, just this year, said he now opposes the legalisation of euthanasia and recommends to other countries they don't go that way. Why? Because of the rapid acceleration of euthanasia in Holland. In the last 5 years, the number of cases have doubled to 5,000 a year. It's not the rare event that it's been suggested tonight. It's now become, he says, the default mode of dying for many people. And he says, as a result, there's intense pressure on doctors to assist in euthanasia. There's travelling end-of-life clinics administering lethal drugs with no prior doctor-patient relationship with the particular people who are given the drugs. And there's a campaign in Holland at the moment that the euthanasia pill be available to everyone over the age of 70, no questions asked. Euthanasia has been used there for much broader, less serious reasons than the ones for which it was first sold to the public, like sight impairment, autism, tinnitus, people with psychiatric illnesses, dementia, loneliness, who feel they're a burden to others. Or we could go across the border to Belgium. The Belgian Parliament in 2002 legalised euthanasia with an R rating for adults only. A decade later, they gave it a G rating. Children can have it now. The bracket creep is real. Professor Raphael Cohen-Almagor in the Journal of Medical Ethics, again only a few weeks ago, wrote that he supports voluntary euthanasia in principle, but not in practice after the experience in Belgium. Again, rapid increase. It's now up to 2,000 cases a year in that country. Half the cases, it's believed, are not reported. It now includes incompetent, demented, depressed people, people who are tired of life. And he gives a whole range of reasons for being suspicious, despite his actually being in favour personally of euthanasia. Or we could go to Oregon, as was presented to us, where voluntary euthanasia is very restricted indeed. In fact, as normally understood, it's still not allowed there. But physician-assisted suicide is. And we're told from the most recent study that in 40% of the cases, it's not, in fact, about suffering. It's not that kind of terrible, hard medical case, such as Professor Singer put to us, but people who are afraid that they are being a burden upon others, especially upon their families, who are electing for physician-assisted suicide. You can't contain this to these hard cases that are offered to us. Once you accept the logic that some people are better off dead and we're going to make them dead, we're going to enable that, out of respect for freedom or out of a desire to relieve suffering, well, of course there are others in the queue. I'm very glad that Peter Singer wants to put limits on that, at least for now. But I am very doubtful about the ability to do so. This year, past, Nathan Verhelst, 44, in Belgium, was euthanized after a sex change operation that didn't turn out how he liked and left him so depressed he wanted to die. Jeffrey Spector in Switzerland has a preemptive strike because he had a very slow growing tumour and he thought one day he'd be a burden on others. Gottlieb de Trova in Belgium against the advice of her GP, without her family knowing anything about it, but because she was despondent after a relationship breakdown. I want limits on it too, like Professor Singer. And I think there's only one limit that works, the one that civilizations down through the centuries have found works. That is, love and care for everyone, respect and protect every human life, and especially those who are most vulnerable.
Okay, we now have about 40 to 45 minutes for you to begin posing questions to our two speakers. You'll see a small fleet of ushers that are here on the two rows. What I'm going to ask you all to do is, while you're getting the attention of the ushers, you might just want to, there are people behind you, the ushers will be sort of trying to triage you so that we have a kind of orderly progression of questions from one to the other speaker. If we can keep the questions nice and brief and, of course, respectful, then we can have around about 5 minutes each for answers. What I'm going to do is, while this sort of carefully managed chaos seems to be happening, I'm going to invite both of our speakers to go ahead and take your places at the podium, just to bring you that much closer to the audience, to put you within throwing range, in other words. While you're doing that, I would love to, if I may sort of abuse my position flagrantly, I would like to just put a very, very brief question to you both. Because the topic is about legalization, it obviously puts much of the emphasis, much of the focus on the role of the state. And of course that brings up the specter of bracket creep, of a progressive and overly permissive state becoming an almost sort of fascist state in terms of the eradication of the unwanted. The other side of this, I fear, has been either just briefly touched on in our conversation so far or hasn't been touched on at all. I wonder about the tacit pressure on those, Archbishop Anthony made a brief reference to it before, the tacit pressure on those that may feel as though they don't want to be a burden to their children, and therefore maybe take a decision in order to, in other words, they feel pressured because they don't want to be a burden to accelerate their death or to take themselves out of the equation. But I also wonder, I suppose, and I put this specifically to Archbishop Anthony, about the other cultural factors that are involved here. It's not just a matter of legalization. It's also the fact that children have dispersed to the wind and are no longer close to their parents. It's the fact that death is increasingly mediated by institutions and not surrounded by family. In other words, I just wonder, I'd love for you both just to weigh in on the more social aspects of this that maybe can't simply be comprehended by this or that piece of legislation. Professor Singer, could I invite you to respond first?
I'm not. I have to admit, I'm not totally sure what exactly your question is. You're asking us to comment on a social situation. We're discussing a rather narrowly focused question: whether we should legalize voluntary euthanasia. We're not trying to analyze why people wish to have voluntary euthanasia. I think there's a whole host of reasons for that. We're not trying to talk about whether there's a breakdown in medical practice, although Anthony Fisher did mention that, I think again without any evidence of such a breakdown occurring in places where euthanasia has been legalized. So I'm sorry, but I'm not going to accept your invitation to discourse about why there may or may not be this demand. Fair enough.
Well, perhaps I could. There are different views. Look, we've all got shameful things in our past, and one of mine is that I was a lawyer. But I repented. But I know from my law school days that there are different views of the role of the law and what its purpose is. But the one I propose tonight is that amongst its first purposes are to protect the weak and vulnerable, to protect the innocent against threats to them. And so I think that is why the common law has always held that killing, especially people who are weak and vulnerable, especially the elderly and little babies and so on, is not on, and why international human rights instruments have said the same. It's a particular view of the very function of law. It has other functions too, but that's a very important one, protecting innocent life and the vulnerable. And I think that Scott is right to hint that we're in a culture now where there will be all sorts of pressures on people, financial pressures, pressures of loneliness, pressures of being abandoned. They've been abandoned to an old people's home. No one visits them anymore. They don't even know their neighbours' names. Cities have become very anonymous. We have a culture that values efficiency and beauty and productivity so highly that, of course, more and more people are going to start feeling my life is meaningless. I'm a burden on others. I shouldn't keep on living and be a burden on my children or on my society. And it's exactly in those situations where we need things like the law and the healthcare professions and others to keep saying, no, you do still matter. You matter terribly. And we're going to do everything we can as a community to help you recover meaning and purpose and to not be so lonely and so forgotten in our community.
Thank you for your indulgence. Our first question, I believe, is to Professor Singer.
So, first of all, thank you to Professor Singer and also your Grace for the debate and for your points forward. My question, Professor, is related to the effect of euthanasia on medical progress. So you mentioned about in Oregon, since it's been introduced in the last 14 years, only just about 100 people have decided to use this option. Well, the same could be said for abortion in Australia. When it was first introduced, very few people used it. Now, statistics stand that it's 83,200 abortions annually in Australia alone. In the States, this figure is in the millions. Now, in regards to the effect of euthanasia on medical progress, as this goes down the line and becomes more acceptable, a large amount of...
Sorry, you were asked to ask a concise question.
We might
not
just get to a nice quick questions here.
In terms of medical progress, it's been due to a lot of clinical trials in the terminally ill. So a key example is in children's cancer. Every single child that comes through the oncology hematology system is enrolled in an international database, right? And as a result, this is why we have the most... Anyway. Sorry. So my question is, will euthanasia in time inhibit medical progress?
No, it won't, because it will still be a small minority of patients who use it. And despite Anthony Fisher's attempt to suggest that in the Netherlands this is now the dominant form of death, the facts are very clear. 3%, 5,000 out of about 150,000 deaths are using euthanasia in the Netherlands, which is, as I said, much more than it is in Oregon, admittedly, where it's 1 in 3,000. It's a hundredth of that. But still, there's still 97% of deaths that are not using it. So I think there will be plenty of evidence if people want to use patients for data gathering or medical research, which is, with the appropriate consent, a proper thing to do. I don't think that progress is going to come to an end because a small number of patients decide, usually when they are already quite close to death, that they wish for physician assistance in ending their lives.
Archbishop Fisher, would you like to respond? Or
just a quick comment. I do think it's been a powerful driver in medical progress that doctors have wanted to save, heal and care. That's driven us to keep pushing at the boundaries of what more we can do, doctors and nurses, to save and heal and care. And we've come a long way in a short time, in a century, really. Well, I do wonder what the effect would be if we thought, well, a lot of geriatric medicine lot of chemotherapy, a lot of palliative care, a lot of what we do towards the end of life, there isn't the same drive because we think that actually that's probably better dealt with by people electing to die earlier. It's more cheaply dealt with, it's more autonomously, it's more mercifully, whatever your reason for favouring that. So I think the question might be right that it will have some effect on the progress of healthcare. I don't know how much.
Our next question is to Archbishop Anthony.
Given that there are tens of thousands of complaints against doctors and hospitals in Australia in any given year, and given that the legal profession is having an absolute feast with complaints against doctors and hospitals, will this law that's proposed be abused?
Well, I've heard people say it's happening anyway, so let's legalise it and then we can regulate it. It'll come out in the open, it'll be better controlled. And I think, of course, the people that say it are pro it anyway. People don't say child abuse is happening anyway, speeding's happening on our roads anyway, let's legalise it and bring it out into the open and regulate it. No, we think it's bad, so we're not going to do that. We're going to find ways of discouraging it. But we do know at the moment that there are many complaints made about our medical profession. I think mostly we have a very high medical and nursing ethics in this country, very high standards in those things. But you do hear many complaints, as we just heard. Why would you imagine in a regime that now allows some killing of patients that suddenly everyone's going to become ethical overnight? We're going to stop having these complaints anymore. Surely you've just added one more opportunity for some kind of shady practice, such as people are complaining of already.
Professor Singer.
Yes, I would like to respond to that. In 1997, together with colleagues from the Monash University Centre for Human Bioethics, where I was working, and Professor Peter Baum, who is a professor of community medicine at the University of New South Wales, we published the results of a survey of Australian physicians about their end-of-life decisions. And that survey showed that the physicians admitted to ending the lives of patients without their informed consent at a higher rate than a study of the Netherlands had shown occurred there. Now, we were not really surprised by this, because clearly if you're in a situation where it is illegal to carry out voluntary euthanasia, where you could be on very serious criminal charges, you may be very hesitant about having an open discussion with your patients about how they would like to end their lives and whether they would wish for assistance, especially as others in the healthcare team may not share your views about that situation. So I think that there is good reason to believe that there is actually more abuse going on in societies like ours, where doctors cannot have this discussion as openly as they can in jurisdictions where it would be fully legal to do so.
Third question come from that side. Yes, terrific. Just.
Thank you. Professor Singer, my name is Daniel Pask, and I have spina bifida meningomyelocele, which the first 23 infants who were killed by the Groningen Protocol also had. They were judged to be in hopeless and unbearable suffering, which those people simply are not. My question is this. Much euthanasia occurs with the objective of avoiding future suffering, with the euthanasia of infants such as myself, or such as I once was, as a good example. However, as the literature on advanced care directives has shown, it is notoriously difficult to predict the level and type of suffering that one may experience at the end of life, and thus to make those sorts of decisions based on the avoidance of future suffering, both either for the extension of life and the acceptance of better medical treatment, or in this case, for euthanasia and assisted death. So I wonder how Professor Singer would reconcile that difficulty of predicting future suffering with the safe legalisation of euthanasia.
Well, again, let's be clear what we're talking about today. We are not discussing infant euthanasia because that cannot be voluntary. It's a different question, whatever views one has. We're also not discussing advance directives. That's a different topic. We do have possibilities of advance directives already in Australia. Patients can legally give directives which lead to their lives being ended through the withdrawal of treatment. And, you know, that's, again, another question. But what I am talking about, what we have agreed to debate, is the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia, which requires only that the patient requesting it have a present state that they do not consider acceptable. It does not necessarily refer to an evaluation of a future state that they are not now experiencing. Of course, the possibility that their state may get worse is something that will be a factor. But one of the advantages of the system that I've talked about in Oregon and Washington and Vermont is that you can ask the doctor to write you a prescription by which you can end your life, as long as you're within that 6 months window of expected life. But you do not have to use the prescription as soon as you get it. As I mentioned, 105 people in 2014 used a prescription in Oregon to end their lives. But 155 people obtained a prescription. So 50 of them had the prescription and did not use it. Why? Clearly, they wanted the reassurance that if things got really bad, they had the means of delivering themselves from that situation right there and could take it when they wanted to. I think what that shows is it's a different sort of situation from advance directives. You can wait until the situation does get too bad, and therefore the problems that you described, which do exist and where I think there's a balance between the value of having the advance directives and the risk of not being able to accurately predict the future situation, that is simply not really germane to the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia in the manner that I've suggested.
Archbishop Fisher, would you like to either respond or pose a question?
I understand Professor Singer's frustration about us wandering into the territory of non-voluntary euthanasia because he came wanting to talk about voluntary euthanasia. But, of course, one of the questions we all have is, where does it lead you? And in Holland, which has been offered to us, the Netherlands, as the great example of the country with the longest experience, the most cases of any country in the world of this, they went from it being only consenting adults, that was absolutely clear in the original medical protocols and then in the change of the law, to adopting the Groningen Protocol that our questioner raised, which was directed particularly at children with spina bifida and some others. So it does go other places. Once you admit the mindset that says we're going to judge who'd be better off dead, we're going to judge that some people are suffering too much or will suffer too much in the future. And I understand the fear then of disability advocates and people living with disabilities that right now people are saying, oh no, it's just adding to your freedom, it's giving you more options. At the same time, it's putting out a message that you're less worthy of protection by our laws, that you're in that other class of people that now the laws of murder don't apply to quite so strictly, that we think you might be better off dead and maybe you should be thinking that way. So I entirely sympathise with the view suggested by our questioner that people with disabilities will be encouraged to have lower self-esteem, lower aspirations for their lives, and those caring for them to put less energy into caring for them and giving them opportunities in life because we've bought into the mentality that says some people are better off dead. We're going to allow, in certain cases, for them to be killed.
Okay, we have our next question, I believe, to Archbishop Fisher.
Just going into the realm of moral philosophy, Archbishop Fisher, in your opening remarks, you stated that you felt that Professor Singer had a instrumental view of life, that the purpose of life, the value of life comes from maximizing autonomy and maximizing the good things, but that you believe there is inherent value to life. Would you mind elaborating a bit on that and justifying why you think that life has intrinsic value in and of itself?
Okay, thank you. That's a very important question, I think. Let me be clear, this isn't just a weird kind of religious view that people that wear strange clothes like me hold to. You know, the view that human beings are special, that their dignity is inalienable, that their lives are inviolable, is no monopoly of believers, and certainly not of Catholic clerics, as you'd know as someone interested in philosophy. It's common to the legal systems of most nations, to international human rights instruments, to the pre-Christian Hippocratic Oath, to the post-Christian World Medical Association Code, to the Code of Ethics of the AMA, which no one's ever accused of being a plant organisation of the Catholic Church. What do they all hold? They hold to this notion of intrinsic human dignity and the inviolability of life, all those examples of instruments and codes in our world. And why? Why do we save the drowning person? Why do we build and staff the hospital emergency wards? Why do we have the firemen and ambulancemen and traffic police? Why do we congratulate new parents? Why do we send birthday cards? On and on. There's so much about what we do and choose in life that is explained by the fact that we know life is a good in itself for human beings. That's what makes sense of so much of our choices, that life is good in itself. You don't have to say to the AMBO, hold on, you don't know if that person's making a sufficient contribution that you're trying to save. Or to the person that pulls someone out of the water, hold on, their preferences might be better satisfied by you leaving them in the water. Or any of those judgments. We just know life's good in itself and it's worth saving and promoting and passing on to children and so on. And that is why, whether you are the leader of this land or you're one of the guys that lives in a cardboard box in the town hall station, but just below us, we revere both equally. Their life is equally valuable, whoever they are, because there's something intrinsic to human beings that we think is inalienable and that means their lives are properly inviolable.
Professor Singer.
Well, there's two things I want to say to that. First, we don't need these ideas of inviolable human life to explain why we save drowning people or why we staff hospitals. Obviously, anyone who knows anything about me knows that I have been writing for the last 40 years now about our obligations to help people in extreme poverty, that I think we in affluent nations ought to be doing far more to reduce the number of people, particularly children, who die from avoidable poverty-related diseases in developing countries. That figure is still around 6 million, although fortunately it has been falling. Of course I think this, and of course I think it because I believe that most people's lives, even if they are going to live in poverty, are positive. That is, that they have all sorts of good experiences that are worth having, that they do all sorts of things that are worth doing. We don't need to have that idea of inherent dignity to explain these things. But the second thing I want to say, and this would admittedly take a longer discussion than we probably have time for tonight, is that when it comes down to adherents of this sanctity of life ethic, including spokespeople for the Roman Catholic Church, they do not really act as if they believe it, because they have this doctrine that says it is permissible to withdraw life support from a patient even when you know that the withdrawal of life support will bring about the death of that patient. They defend this by saying there is no obligation to provide burdensome or disproportionate treatment. But if you ask what makes the treatment disproportionate or burdensome, it's sometimes very mysterious. For example, this doctrine was applied and endorsed by the Roman Catholic Bishop of New Jersey in the famous case of Karen Ann Quinlan, a woman who was in a long-term coma, where the parents, who were also Catholic, with the support of their bishop, asked the court to withdraw the respirator from Karen Quinlan. Now, if that is supposed to be because the treatment was burdensome, where's the burden? She was unconscious. So if you want to withdraw the treatment, it has to be that you think life must have some positive quality to be worth supporting. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see why you would think that it's you ought to withdraw life support, knowing that Karen, or believing anyway, actually she didn't die immediately, but believing that she would die if you did withdraw the respirator. So really, there are many cases like this. In fact, every 13 minutes in Australia, life support is withdrawn from a patient in an intensive care unit. The church does not go around saying that this is a terrible thing, because it accepts that this is a reasonable thing to do under the circumstances. But it can't really make sense of that while saying every life is of equal value, even if you're in a coma, even if you're going to die in an hour or in 24 hours, every minute is of equal value. That doesn't really make sense given current medical practices, which the church does not oppose.
I am hoping, like you, that some of these more substantive points of disagreement might be picked up in our final closing statements, just to prod. Our next question, I believe, to Professor Singer.
Professor Singer, thank you, Your Grace. Professor Singer, my question is, are people with severe dementia capable of realising their best preferences? And if not, is there any reason why they should not be euthanized, particularly since they can be such a drain on the resources of those people around them?
Look, I've said this a couple of times tonight. We are debating the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia. People with severe dementia cannot request voluntary euthanasia because they are not competent adults. I've said many times this is a law about competent adults. There are many other topics we could debate. We could debate questions of whether people with dementia should or should not be kept alive. And I notice I said kept alive because the Catholic Church might well accept that we don't have to treat pneumonia in a patient with severe dementia, even though treating pneumonia is a very simple thing to do. You have antibiotics to do it. So those are very interesting questions. But I'm sorry, just like the question about the Groningen Protocol, which, by the way, in my understanding, the number of infants whose lives have been ended under the Groningen Protocol in the Netherlands is under 20 over about the last 10 or 15 years. I know I'm not really going to answer that question. I'm sorry.
Archbishop Fisher.
Again, I understand the frustration because Professor Singer wants to limit this just to voluntary. But of course, just like I'm not going to refuse to discuss withdrawal of treatments and say that's not in the topic, that's not euthanasia, not defined so in law or in medical practice. Therefore, I'm not going to answer the question. I'm quite happy to enter that debate. And I think the reason people ask, well, what about people with dementia? What about people with severe handicaps? What about people in comas, such as the feeding case that the professor himself raised from New Jersey? Why do people ask that? Because they're trying to get to the bottom of what are your real reasons? What are you really about when you're doing this? Where will it lead us as a community? So I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask, and I'd be saying clearly in a euthanasia regime, people with dementia will be more and more at risk. And that's what the two recent critics I mentioned, both of them pro-euthanasia, the one in Holland, one in Belgium, have both said that they think people with dementia are particularly at risk in their two countries. On the withdrawal of treatment question, of course doctors have always understood that when they're trying to save, heal and care, they are taking risks, hopefully only reasonable risks, and there are times when they can't fix everything and make everything nice, and there are times when there are things they could do, but the burden it would put on the patient would just be too great to get them a bit more life. And so sometimes it's perfectly reasonable to say, we've done enough. We're going to keep loving you, we're going to keep caring, we're going to keep feeding, we're going to keep keeping you warm, keep holding your hand, but enough. No more transplants, no more complicated remedies. Perfectly reasonable. Do we put on those doctors' and nurses' backs the thought that really they're killers? Because really they could have kept the person alive a few more minutes or a few more hours. And I'd say no, because that's not their intention when they do that. They want to keep you as comfortable as possible for as long as you're going to live, but they're not trying to shorten your life. Of course someone else might give you morphine or take you off life support because they want you dead. And then it would be euthanasia or something worse. But if the reason they're doing it is a perfectly reasonable one, such as that it's just too burdensome on you or it's not working, then we shouldn't put on their shoulders the accusation that they're the equivalent of people who commit homicide.
Yes, our next question. We do have 10 minutes remaining. I'm seeing an awfully long line of people. Can I just profusely apologize? Let's just try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
You've already preempted some of my question with the last couple of responses, but I just want to ask you again, Archbishop Fisher, you advocated for the use of palliative care, which allows me as a physician, which I am, to use strong narcotics and in very rare instances to sometimes sedate patients terminally if their symptoms can't be relieved, knowing full well that they will die of dehydration eventually. So Professor Singer attributed a definition of euthanasia of actions or omissions which shorten life. So are we not already practicing euthanasia?
I think it's a very good question because I think it's in a lot of people's minds. It looks like euthanasia. It looks the same. Because the definition I offered and that Professor Singer so generously said we'd go by tonight wasn't an act or calculated course of omission that causes death. That is intended to cause death. And so we've still got to ask, why do you do it? Now, there would be some people in palliative care out there that are making the judgment, I wish she'd just hurry up and die for her sake, for the family's sake, for our sake, for whatever reason. And I'm going to keep upping the dose until I make sure that happens. And another palliative care physician will say, no, I want to keep her as comfortable as possible and I'll keep upping the dose until I'm confident there's no pain. Now, it looks the same to people on the outside, but it's hugely different to you and to who you are, what you're about. Am I a saver, healer, carer? Or am I someone that is sometimes choosing deliberately to do things that shorten life? And I think, as I say, a reformed lawyer, we know there's a difference between someone that deliberately goes out running over old ladies in their car and someone who distractedly playing with their radio bumps into someone and someone again who gets a flat tyre and veers into someone. What's the difference? What makes one homicide, one manslaughter, and one not a crime at all? Intention. It really goes to the heart of so many of the judgments we make in healthcare or in ordinary life.
Professor Singer. Thank you, Professor Singer.
Well, I want to get a lot of questions, so let me just say, I think the question of what your intention is a rather slippery one, and in many cases you may have more than one goal in mind, and I still think that, in response to the question, I think the answer is we are often intentionally ending life. That is at least among the goals with which physicians act in intensive care units and in undertaking palliative care all the time.
And next question. Thank you. And I believe it's to Professor Singer. Thank you.
Professor Singer, in your 1979 book, Personal Ethics,
Practical ethics.
Practical ethics.
Let's get it right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now in its third edition and available on sale.
Thank you. Thank you.
You deny personhood to newborn babies.
Look, I'm
ranking
sorry,
them-
I'm not going to discuss this
Yeah.
topic. I've said it many times. Would
Fine,
you please
but-
not ask questions?
But the
about my
reality
views on that?
is that there is a slippery slope heading other places, and your own writings admit that when you say, quote, that newborn babies rank less value than the life of
Not a
a
question.
dog
This is
or
a statement.
chimpanzee, okay, and that you advocate the right of parents to use.
Would mind waiting for a moment, sir. Thank you. This is directed to Professor Singer. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Professor Singer, Your Grace, thank you for a great discussion tonight. Professor Singer, you talked about before about conversations that aren't being had because voluntary euthanasia is not legalised, so it makes it difficult to have the conversation. What about the conversations that are being had? You've talked about some countries tonight and states, and the overwhelming number of expert committees, legislatures, which have studied the question whether euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide should be legalised. Why do you think they have concluded, these expert committees, they should not be legalised?
I don't think that there is an overwhelming number of such committees that have reached that conclusion. There are some committees that have reached that conclusion. There are other investigations that have not. For example, I mentioned the Canadian investigation by Justice Lynn Smith and the upholding of that by the Supreme Court of Canada. I didn't mention that the Royal Society of Canada also held an investigation into this, which recommended the legalisation of physician-assisted dying. The province of Quebec had its own parliamentary inquiry into this and has legislated. That legislation might now not be relevant because of the Supreme Court's decision, but it was on the road to legalising physician-assisted suicide in the province of Quebec. Obviously, in the countries where it has been legalised, like the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg, inquiries have come out in favour. So I don't agree that there is a preponderance of decisions against this. And my expectation is that future inquiries will be more likely to go in favour of it because they will have more evidence and more observation of other countries that are practicing it.
If it's okay, I think we might, unless there's something very specific, Archbishop, that you wanted to say, I think we might just move to the next question, if that's all right. Thank you.
All right, thank you. This question is to Archbishop Fisher. I was born in Ethiopia. When I was born, my mom actually told me that I was terminally ill. That's what the doctor told her, that I would die soon. They need to operate on me. She refused and she took me back home. And I'm still alive. And what I'm trying to say is that when doctors say that someone is terminally ill, I reckon they should say that their ability to help has terminated. And I think they start looking to say there is something in higher power that they can look onto. So what I'm trying to say in my question is, can faith play part in this process? Because at the end of the day, euthanasia is about relief.
Thank you. I think that is very much a question for me. I do think faith's quite important here, but let me say to begin with that I think it's interesting that people commonly divide over issues like abortion or same-sex marriage along religious lines. Not entirely, but commonly. But over this issue, it seems to cross the usual faith and political divides. The idea of the preciousness of human life is no monopoly of Christians or of believers. It's common, as I say, to pre-Christian Hippocratic oath, to cultures, to Asian cultures, to African cultures, to many different cultures before or without contact with Christianity, as well as Christian cultures and Christian-inspired people. And so I'd say whether you have faith or no faith, judge me on my arguments, and I hope they persuaded you rather than my religious habit. That said, I think you do raise a question, well, what does faith bring to this discussion? And I think it does bring certain additional reasons to care passionately about human beings. But when we see them as the image of God in our world, that we see them as entrusted to our care, that you're not going to give up easily on people in that situation. Doesn't mean that you'll just fight forever no matter what, people alive no matter what, but you'll do a lot. You really will try very hard, as your mum apparently did for you, because you think this little one or this old one is very precious. You see God in their eyes. As a pastor, I have cared for people who were dying, and some of them had very hard dyings. And I think that I sympathise with why people would want that to finish. Christians we don't get a free pass on this. It's not like having faith fixes it all for you. We're in there with the rest of humanity trying to make sense of suffering and of death, and we don't pretend there are easy answers to it. But what I do think we do is walk our talk about really investing ourselves in hospital systems, in hospice care, in palliative care, in medical research, in one way or another, try to be in there helping the little one like you as a baby in Ethiopia, or the old one and everyone in between as best we can.
Professor Singer, if you
No,
have a
let's move on
specific
with the
response
next
to give, then I'm happy to move on to the next
Yeah,
question.
let's move.
Thank you.
Professor Singer, Your Grace, thank you for your debate this evening. Professor Singer, my question is to you. 3 years ago, my brother was diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer. Not long after this diagnosis, and after many rounds of chemo, he thought about ending his life prematurely. As his condition deteriorated, he became more aware of all our family and friends caring and loving him. This brought him to such peace that he no longer felt that he needed to prematurely end his life. Though he was in pain and with much suffering, he was happy and at peace when he died. He lived almost a year longer than his doctors thought that he would. Mr. Singer, who are you to decide that some human lives are worth less than others?
I don't understand the connection between the description of your brother's situation, or for that matter, anything that I've been arguing, and your claim that I am deciding for anyone else when they should live or die. On the contrary, thank you. On the contrary, it is the position of my opponent that many people should not be able to decide for themselves how long they live when they have a terminal disease or a grievous and irremediable medical condition. My position is that I am advocating voluntary euthanasia, the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia. That will give people exactly the choice that your brother, I'm glad to say, your brother didn't actually have that choice, legally anyway. Maybe he could have nevertheless been capable of ending his life. One can, of course, do it even when it's illegal. But your brother chose not to end his life. And of course, under what I'm proposing, your brother could have made that choice with complete freedom.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Thank you.
Professor Singer, my question has to do with the issue of autonomy. You stressed more than once in your opening speech that you are not an absolutist about autonomy, that you recognise there are cases where we can rightly override a person's autonomy. The example you gave was a lovesick young man who is convinced he'll never be happy again. Now, as I take it, in that case, the point of overriding his wish to die is that we know better. We really do know better. He won't be as miserable as this. What about cases where, okay, the case I'm imagining is an elderly woman, she has a terminal condition, causes her terrible suffering, 6 months to live. Her only reason for not asking to be put out of that misery is her belief that she'll be punished in the afterlife. Let's assume. Now, suppose that you're her son, you know her well, and like you, I presume, you think this belief of hers is mistaken. You think you know better than her about what is in her interests on a utilitarian understanding of those interests. What exactly would be wrong on your premises with overriding her autonomy in that case and putting her out of her misery?
Sorry to keep saying this, but the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia would allow her to say, I do not wish to use voluntary euthanasia because I believe I will be punished in hell.
It seems about choice, but there's no euthanasia doctor out there that I know of, unless they're a complete fanatic, who's going to say it's for all comers. Anyone that wants it can have it. Now here it is. You're competent, as long as you're not completely loony. Here's the injection. Here's the drug. Doctors are still going to decide who they think is sufficiently, whether they're just a love-struck teenager and therefore they shouldn't have it. But in the case of the woman I talked about, she was an old person who'd had a relationship breakdown and she was given euthanasia in Belgium. What's the difference? Well, she's old and this one's young. Or the difference might be some other different assessment that you make. But one way or another, the doctor's still going to decide whose requests they think are the appropriate ones. They're still going to make a judgment about who's better off alive and who's better off dead. And so while we talk about it as being this great new freedom for the patient, in the end, it's the doctors who will be deciding. In fact, they'll have more power now because previously they didn't have this in their medical armoury, this way of dealing with people. And I think it puts a huge burden on them to have to make that decision. But one way or another, as I think the questioner was hinting at, it's still doctor knows best.
Professor Singer, would you like to respond?
Well, look, firstly, if a doctor doesn't want to have this burden, a doctor, under all of these legal systems I've been talking about, there is a right of conscientious refusal to provide assistance in dying. So the doctor does not have to have the burden. The doctor can just say, as no doubt many doctors will, I do not think that it's right to provide this and I'm not going to do it. I think a doctor ought then to say there may be other doctors you can find who will do this for you. So in terms of the power of the doctors, don't forget that, as I said before, doctors are all the time making these decisions to withdraw treatment, which has the effect, whatever the doctor's intention, has the effect that the patient dies. So if the doctor judges that enough is enough, that the treatment would be burdensome, that is also the doctor deciding for the patient. It's very hard to construct any system in which the doctor does not have more say than the patient or a typical member of the public. I believe that legalizing voluntary euthanasia would shift the balance in the direction of the patient, but I don't think that it would eliminate some power that doctors still have over their patients.
And this is our last question. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you for the opportunity for letting me speak. I understand we're running short of time. Archbishop, I was just wondering if you could please engage with my suggestion that the way that we currently actually do withdraw treatment from patients and that it has been supported, at least elsewhere by the church, and the current methods of, keeping on administering morphine, things like that, which obviously do result in death. I wonder if you'd consider my suggestion that that's actually quite cowardly and it's skirting around the law, because really we all know that that's going to result in certain death pretty much. It's just a matter of when. I'm just wondering if you think it might actually be a little bit more straightforward and more humane if we're talking about respecting life and respecting the beauty and the importance of life, to actually allow less suffering and more dignity.
I think we have to be very careful about what we're asking of our health professionals, and basically to be accusing them of a kind of cowardice in their choosing, as those professions have done for thousands of years now, to never deliberately shorten life, but to respect the fact there are times when there's not much more you can do to help, and where anything you did do to try and extend life would come at a huge burden to the patient. That judgment that they make, or the judgment they make when turning up the pain relief to make sure the person's comfortable, not a bit more to quicken their death, but at least to we're sure they're comfortable, that when they're making those judgments, they're not being cowardly. It's not that they're somehow trying to keep clean hands and a pure conscience while really doing what we all know is murder, or with consent, euthanasia. That's not what's happening there. And we go back to the question of what are their intentions? Of course someone could be engaging in an elaborate sophistry and really intending to shorten someone's life, doing what looks the same to an outsider. So we've got to ask our health professionals to be very honest with themselves and with us, and we've got to examine our own hearts in what we're asking for in life. What am I really about when I'm doing this? And am I trying my level best to save and heal and care, or am I willing in certain circumstances to harm or kill or abandon because I think that's good for some other reason? And I think there is a real difference, even though I agree with you, that can look the same from the outside. I think there's something that runs very deep about who we are and what we're doing at issue here.
Professor Singh, would you like to respond?
Well, really, just to say that I think if you look at the pressures that doctors are under in intensive care units, and I think it's a pity, I have to say, that funds have got to a point where doctors are under great pressure, where they can't spend as much time talking to their patients as really they would like to do and would be good for the patients. I think that it's really very difficult to ask of doctors what Anthony Fisher has just asked them, to be so honest with themselves in this situation, to know truly what their motives and their intentions are. And that's why I think we ought to be more open about saying we are taking end-of-life decisions, we're taking them for a variety of reasons, and if we're not able to have open discussions with the patients about whether they want our assistance to shorten their lives, then we are increasing the likelihood that there will be poor communication and we will end up doing what patients have not asked us to do, actually shortening their lives without their consent.
Now, I lied before. We have one final question just here at the front. I didn't intentionally lie, but I did mislead you. Set to go?
Thank you very much for allowing me to get the final question in. I really want to address this to Bishop Fisher. I'm just wondering if euthanasia was to be legalised, I think there may in fact be a positive paradox that actually can occur. Currently, the issue of euthanasia is quite taboo. By actually bringing it out into the open and discussing it, people may in fact be required to seek counselling and to talk about ending their life. So it may in fact provide greater access to counselling and resources, and in fact they may overturn the decision to actually want to end their life. So there could be a positive paradox happening there.
Wonderful question.
I think that's a fair point. I think you could do euthanasia in more or less humane ways, more or less open, transparent ways, and that could include that you get second and third opinions, that you get extra counselling, that one way or another you try to make sure that this is honest and transparent. And there are real pluses to that compared to any regime of covert euthanasia. What I think would be better than both overt euthanasia and covert euthanasia is no euthanasia. That we actually develop a society and the ethics of our health professionals that is one that is life-affirming and person-affirming to everyone who's at the end of life or has a serious disability or who is in great pain or is feeling terribly lonely and depressed, or whatever the candidates for euthanasia, that we find ways of addressing those problems directly rather than the route of dealing with suffering by killing the suffering person.
Now, Professor Singer, you have a choice. You have the final closing argument. You can either answer that question or I can give you a little bit of extra time, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Thank you. I think we've had a really interesting exchange, but I do think that you need to remember what it is that we're talking about, and you need to look at the facts of the situation as it exists in the real world. I believe that the evidence suggests it is possible to legalise voluntary euthanasia in ways that are narrow, and I think that that is a reasonable, practical reform to work for. I think we should follow the examples of those jurisdictions that have legalised it in a narrow way and see how that works for us. Let that be a kind of social laboratory. We can, after all, rescind legislation. We have done that on a number of issues where we recognise a mistake. I think that we ought to go ahead with allowing people who are very keen to be able to end their lives where they have very serious grounds for doing so, to do it. In the United States, in the last year, we had what I think was the rather absurd situation of a relatively young woman called Brittany Maynard, 29 years old, who'd been told that she had a kind of brain tumour, cancer, that was not going to be treatable and that would lead to her death not within 6 months, but within roughly a year. Of course, she was devastated by this news, so was her husband. She was fairly recently married. She was living in California, where she could not have had control over the end of her life. She decided on receiving that diagnosis to uproot herself and her husband and move to Oregon, so that when the tumour developed, she could decide to end her life in the way that she wanted to. The tumour did unfortunately develop as predicted, so about a year after the original diagnosis in Oregon, she used the legislation that she had there. I should say, by the way, that there's a residence qualification for the use of the law in Oregon. She had to move there 6 months before making use of it. So she did that, and she recorded, she made a video about her decision and wrote about it. She was supported by her husband, she was supported by her mother. I think it's good that somebody like that should have the choice about how they want to end their life. But I think it's a pity that she had to move from California to Oregon to do that, and it would be more of an absurdity still, of course, if somebody had to move from Australia to Oregon, or Switzerland is a country that does accept people to end their life in that way without the residence requirement. I think it's absurd that people should only be able to access that if they have the ability to travel, which of course they don't always if they're seriously ill, and the resources to do that. So I think we should follow that example. We should allow people like Brittany Maynard to exercise their choice, and I think, as I say, the evidence is that that can be done without posing a risk to the other vulnerable members of our community. Thank you.
Archbishop Fisher, I'll invite you to deliver your closing argument.
Well, my thanks to you all, and especially to Professor Singer for this, I think, very civil discussion of a very important issue tonight, and it's gone at some depth. Last year, the Newcastle Knights player Alex McKinnon suffered a dangerous tackle against Melbourne Storm and woke up from an induced coma, quadriplegic. His thoughts were naturally dark. He wanted to die, but his mum wouldn't hear of it, and he attributes his survival to her positive response. Now he's living courageously with his disabilities and an advocate for safety in football. In a euthanasia regime, it's not clear that such people will live. Their health professionals may judge them better off dead and not try so hard. Their families might buy into that mentality too and stop being so encouraging. The patients themselves, who are naturally despondent, may well volunteer for death. After all, those suffering from depression or demoralisation are 4 times more likely to request euthanasia. I used to live at the Gap, where suicide regularly occurs. And the so-called angel of the Gap, Don Ritchie, was given Australian Day honours for intervening when he saw people at the edge of the Gap. He'd bring them a cup of tea and say, "Would you like to talk to someone?" Gave them a few encouraging words. What's the difference between the would-be Gap jumper and someone with a difficult prognosis? Now, why is the first treated as a life worth living and the second not? Why do we offer counsel to the first and death to the second? The practice of euthanasia inevitably changes our law and healthcare and society. It damages people's self-respect and relationships. Put baldly, I think it will make vulnerable people more vulnerable and suffering people suffer more. Tonight I've argued we shouldn't go down the path of state-sanctioned lethal injections. That we can do better for those in pain or who are lonely or feel that they are a burden or fear they're dying. It might be more demanding, perhaps especially on the bystanders and carers. But these are precisely the situations where the human spirit can most shine. I think tonight's debate goes to the very heart of the kind of community we will be in the future. Will it be one where the young and the frail elderly, the sick and the sorry, the depressed and the disabled are devalued and more at risk, or one where they will be protected and nurtured? Thank you.